There are 5 kinds of wars. There's a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war, a capital war, which we're in the midst of, and then there's a military war.
Get ready for an economic crash by Ray Dalio.
The study, I needed to understand things that were happening to us. I'm a global macro investor, and there are things that are happening in our lifetimes that never happened before. The amount of spending financed by debt, the amount of internal conflict, the rise of great power in the form of China to challenge the existing world order, and so on, the alliances with Russia and all of that. And so I needed to study the rise and decline of reserve currency, so I went back 500 years to see the Dutch guilder and the patterns of the past. It helps me. And then when I did the study, I did a book because I thought it was important to pass along. And then I wanted to make it very clear and digestible. So the animation that you're talking about is very clear and digestible, so people can put what's now happening in the perspective of these historical patterns, which helps people think about what's coming next. We're not going to give you the gold that the dollar is backed by, and we had a devaluation. It took me by surprise. I walked on the floor of the stock exchange. I thought it was going to go down a lot. It went up a lot. And that's because I never experienced the currency devaluation. I found the same exact thing when I studied history. Same exact announcement took place on March 5th, 1933 by Roosevelt and had the same effect. So I understood then how history before me was important. Studying the Great Depression allowed me and Bridgewater to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis. If I didn't study that, what's happening now is very relevant, is a guide to the past, is a guide to what's happening now. Likelihood of some kind of war. There are 5 kinds of wars. There's a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war, a capital war, which we're in the midst of, and then there's a military war. And those things drive countries to be self-sufficient and independent. And as a result, globalization diminishes and nationalism increases. You have to have an economy in which the people believe that you have a fair system, and you have to have productivity. So I would say the most important thing is the redistribution of opportunity to make people productive and to eliminate the internal conflict, or to reduce the internal conflict, which can be so disruptive. When you see large wealth gaps, and at the same time you see economic problems, you have a lot of internal conflict, and that internal conflict is bad economically and it's bad socially. So yes, I think but it's not just the wealth gap, it is the productivity level that results. So the wealth gap is a problem, the opportunity gap is a problem, the productivity that allows, and productivity can be measured in what you earn relative to what you spend. So yes, all of that, that gap is an issue, and it's certainly going to be a political issue. So when we talk about markets and the economy and all of these things, we have to realize, for example, that there's a great internal politics, populism of the left and populism of the right, and the polarity is becoming greater. It's entirely possible that neither side accepts losing the 2024 elections. In other words, that we lose, the democracy, in a sense, you could find ourselves in a situation where the rules no longer apply because of that type of internal conflict. Internal conflict will have a big effect. And the printing of money, the monetization of debt, is a last phase in a long-term debt cycle, because it indicates that when there's a lot of debt and there's a zero interest rate and you print that money, that debt monetization has its effects. So what we're seeing now in the market is very, very, very classic. It's happened repeatedly, in that enormous amount of buying power created by the creation of money, which doesn't raise living standards, that is passing through the system. And so you're seeing it happen in the inflation of goods, services, and financial assets. It's not, if you have a large wealth gap or opportunity gap, and you have rising living standards, you don't have the same kind of conflict risks. It's the three, when the three work together. When you have a financial problem, and so you can't resolve that easily, and then you have the conflicts, and they can be over wealth, that's the left-right conflict, but there are other conflicts that end up, it could be, we see it about groups, that people tend to gather in groups. It could be ethnic, it could be whatever. And so you see that when you have that, and you have challenges, other challenges like the rising power challenging another, there's more tension. And if you start to have lower living standards from that and a sense of inequity, it produces more conflict. That's happened repeatedly. That mix has happened repeatedly. Because like debt, at the end of the day, it's going to be one way or another. It's either going to be when somebody borrows and you're using that debt, is that going to produce productivity so that in hard money terms, that money can be paid back in a way where, okay, it paid off in a productivity increasing way? Or is that not going to be paid off? And somebody's always going to pay, but it's going to be the bondholder, it's going to be the cash holder who is going to pay if that doesn't come back with real productivity. And right now, it was an emergency situation with COVID mixed with a political situation to disperse a lot of money. And that's what we have, but it's not ending there because that's the new policy. There are two types of inflation, okay? Let me just clarify. There's supply-demand inflation, like if demand is pressing up against capacity to produce things, and maybe that's labor, maybe that's capacity constraints and so on and so forth, prices rise because of that. And then there's monetary inflation. And monetary inflation is because the currency and the value of money goes down. And so you can see, like in the 1970s, stagflation. You could see inflation is not coming from the first of those types of inflation. It is coming from the second of those types of inflation. And the way that would occur is because people don't want to own bonds. To me, it's pretty crazy to want to own cash or bonds. Okay, we can get into why that is. But if you have that movement out of like that type of financial assets to other assets, which we are seeing, then that has the effect first of causing financial inflation. In other words, an investor shifts it to another investment and they go up in value. And then that wealth effect has an effect on those items that people who acquire the money want to spend on. So maybe it's on penthouses or maybe it's on something else, but it depends how that's spent. I'm more worried about the monetary inflation, which would look something like a currency defense. It means that what happens is, as money, let's say people don't like bonds, and then they start to sell bonds, and bonds then go down in value because they have a capital loss, and they don't offer anything in interest rates, negative real interest rates and so on. They don't like that. Then the Federal Reserve or other central banks are faced with the choice of either rates rise, and that is bad for financial asset prices and it's bad for the economy, or they make the purchases. They make money and they make the purchases of that, and that then produces more of a monetary inflation. So it's the second that I'm more concerned with. But the supply demand of debt will be, I think, the big driving influence. And I want to emphasize this because so many people say, okay, well, here, they look at this stock or they look at this. But what you saw was the V bottom in all markets and so on. And that was due to debt and money dynamic happening. So that's the biggest dynamic to pay attention to.
We had calculated that a number of the entities would not be able to pay back their debt. When there's a certain rate of debt growth that is unsustainable and that there's going to be a problem paying it back, when you do the calculations, you could see that you have a problem. When you start to have a debt problem and you're close to zero interest rates, that means that the central bank, the Federal Reserve's ability to deal with that won't work. You'll hit zero. And then you enter a new world. Okay, the last time that happened was 1928 to 1929, 30, 31. That's what happened. What happened in 2007 and 9 was the exact same thing. A debt crisis, too much debt, and you hit zero interest rates and out of luck. And then what happens, there's a classic way of dealing with that, is that the central bank has got to print money and go buy financial assets. And so that's what all the entities did. And so by being able to watch it day by day as to how they went about doing that, allowed us to navigate the crisis so that we could see the rates of deterioration and then the actions taken to end that in much the same way as the Federal Reserve ended it in 1932, 1933, for the same reasons. Now that printing of money and the buying of financial assets causes financial assets to go up in price, right, puts money into the economy, and produces the type of reaction that we've now seen in terms of that economy and those markets. Then we're at the stage of the cycle where we are now. And what happens classically is that those financial purchases help those who have financial assets more than they help those who don't. And it causes a greater wealth gap. And very classically, that causes populism, right, because there's a gap between the wealth and then you move into a situation that's very similar. So being able to see mechanically how that dynamic worked allowed us to navigate it well.